As the day wore on, everything grew sticky to the touch, and Rieu felt his anxiety increasing after each visit. That evening a neighbor of his old patient in the suburbs started vomiting, pressing his hand to his groin, and running a high fever accompanied by delirium. The ganglia were much bigger than Monsieur Michel's. One of them was beginning to suppurate, and presently split open like an overripe fruit. On returning to his apartment, Rieu rang up the medical stores depot for the district. In his professional diary for the day, the only entry was, "Negative reply." Already he was receiving calls for similar cases from various parts of the town. Obviously the abscesses had to be lanced. 2 crisscross strokes, and the ganglion disgorged a mixture of blood and pus. Their limbs stretched out as far as they could manage. The sick men went on bleeding. Dark patches appeared on their legs and stomachs. Sometimes a ganglion would stop suppurating, then suddenly swell again. Usually the sick man died in a stench of corruption. The local press, so lavish of news about the rats, now had nothing to say. For rats died in the street, men in their homes. And newspapers are concerned only with the street. Meanwhile, government and municipal officials were putting their heads together. So long as each individual doctor had come across only 2 or 3 cases, no one had thought of taking action. But it was merely a matter of adding up the figures, and once this had been done, the total was startling. In a very few days, the number of cases had risen by leaps and bounds, and it became evident to all observers of this strange malady that a real epidemic had set in. This was the state of affairs when Castel, one of Rieu's colleagues and a much older man than he, came to see him. "Naturally," he said to Rieu. "You know what it is. I'm waiting for the result of the postmortems." "Well, I know, and I don't need any postmortems. I was in China for a good part of my career, and I saw some cases in Paris 20 years ago. Only no one dared to call them by their name on that occasion. The usual taboo, of course. The public mustn't be alarmed. That wouldn't do at all. And then, as one of my colleagues said, it's unthinkable. Everyone knows it's ceased to appear in Western Europe." "Yes, everyone knew that, except the dead men." "Come now, Rieu. You know as well as I do what it is." Rieu pondered. He was looking out of the window of his surgery, at the tall cliff that closed the half-circle of the bay on the far horizon. Though blue, the sky had a dull sheen that was softening as the light declined. "Yes, Castel," he replied. "It's hardly credible, but everything points to its being plague." Castel got up and began walking toward the door. "You know," the old doctor said, "what they're going to tell us? That it vanished from temperate countries long ago." "Vanished? What does that word really mean?" Rieu shrugged his shoulders. "Yes, and don't forget, just under 20 years ago. In Paris, too." "Right. Let's hope it won't prove any worse this time than it did then. But really, it's incredible."
The word plague had just been uttered for the first time. At this stage of the narrative, with Dr. Bernard Rieu standing at his window, the narrator may, perhaps, be allowed to justify the doctor's uncertainty and surprise, since with very slight differences, his reaction was the same as that of the great majority of our townsfolk. Everybody knows that pestilences have a way of recurring in the world, yet somehow we find it hard to believe in ones that crash down on our heads from a blue sky. There have been as many plagues as wars in history, yet always plagues and wars take people equally by surprise. In fact, like our fellow citizens, Rieu was caught off his guard, and we should understand his hesitations in the light of this fact, and similarly understand how he was torn between conflicting fears and confidence. When a war breaks out, people say, "It's too stupid, it can't last long." But though a war may well be too stupid, that doesn't prevent its lasting.
Stupidity has a knack of getting its way, as we should see if we were not always so much wrapped up in ourselves.
In this respect, our townsfolk were like everybody else, wrapped up in themselves. In other words, they were humanists. They disbelieved in pestilences. A pestilence isn't a thing made to man's measure. Therefore, we tell ourselves that pestilence is a mere bogey of the mind, a bad dream that'll pass away. But it doesn't always pass away, and from one bad dream to another, it's men who pass away. And the humanists first of all, because they haven't taken their precautions. Our townsfolk weren't more to blame than others. They forgot to be modest, that was all, and thought that everything still was possible for them, which presupposed that pestilences were impossible. They went on doing business, arranged for journeys, and formed views. How should they have given a thought to anything like plague, which rules out any future, cancels journeys, silences the exchange of views? They fancy themselves free, and no one will ever be free so long as there are pestilences. Indeed, even after Dr. Rieu had admitted in his friend's company that a handful of persons scattered about the town had without warning died of plague, the danger still remained fantastically unreal. For the simple reason that, when a man is a doctor, he comes to have his own ideas of physical suffering, and to require somewhat more imagination than the average. Looking from his window at the town, outwardly quite unchanged, the doctor felt little more than a faint qualm for the future, a vague unease. He tried to recall what he had read about the disease. Figures floated across his memory, and he recalled that some 30 or so great plagues known to history had accounted for nearly 100 million deaths. But what are 100 million deaths? When one has served in a war, one hardly knows what a dead man is after a while. And since a dead man has no substance unless one has actually seen him dead, 100 million corpses broadcast through history are no more than a puff of smoke in the imagination. The doctor remembered the plague at Constantinople that, according to Procopius, caused 10,000 deaths in a single day. 10,000 dead made about 5 times the audience in a biggish cinema. Yes, that was how it should be done. You should collect the people at the exits of 5 picture houses. You should lead them to a city square and make them die in heaps if you wanted to get a clear notion of what it means. Then at least you could add some familiar faces to the anonymous mass. But naturally that was impossible to put into practice. Moreover, what man knows 10,000 faces? In any case, the figures of those old historians, like Procopius, weren't to be relied on. That was common knowledge. 70 years ago at Canton, 40,000 rats died of plague before the disease spread to the inhabitants. But again, in the Canton epidemic, there was no reliable way of counting up the rats. A very rough estimate was all that could be made, with obviously a wide margin for error. Let's see, the doctor murmured to himself. Supposing the length of a rat to be 10 inches, 40,000 rats placed end to end would make a line of... He pulled himself up sharply. He was letting his imagination play pranks, the last thing wanted just now. A few cases, he told himself, don't make an epidemic. They merely call for serious precautions. He must fix his mind, first of all, on the observed facts. Stupor and extreme prostration, buboes, intense thirst, delirium, dark blotches on the body, internal dilatation, and, in conclusion, some words came back to the doctor's mind. Aptly enough, the concluding sentence of the description of the symptoms given in his medical handbook. The pulse becomes fluttering, dichrotic, and intermittent, and death ensues as the result of the slightest movement. Yes, in conclusion, the patient's life hung on a thread, and 3 people out of 4, he remembered the exact figures, were too impatient not to make the very slight movement that snapped the thread. The doctor was still looking out of the window. Beyond it lay the tranquil radiance of a cool spring sky. Inside the room, a word was echoing still, the word plague. A word that conjured up in the doctor's mind not only what science chose to put into it, but a whole series of fantastic possibilities utterly out of keeping with that gray and yellow town under his eyes, from which were rising the sounds of mild activity characteristic of the hour. A drone rather than a bustling, the noises of a happy town, in short, if it's possible to be at once so dull and happy. A tranquility so casual and thoughtless seemed almost effortlessly to give the lie to those old pictures of the plague. Athens, a charnel house reeking to heaven and deserted even by the birds. Chinese towns cluttered up with victims silent in their agony. The convicts at Marseille piling rotting corpses into pits. The building of the Great Wall in Provence to fend off the furious plague wind. The damp, putrefying pallets stuck to the mud floor at the Constantinople Lazar House, where the patients were hauled up from their beds with hooks. The carnival of masked doctors at the Black Death. Men and women copulating in the cemeteries of Milan. Cartloads of dead bodies rumbling through London's ghoul-haunted darkness. Nights and days filled always, everywhere, with the eternal cry of human pain. No, all those horrors weren't near enough as yet even to ruffle the equanimity of that spring afternoon. The clang of an unseen streetcar came through the window, briskly refuting cruelty and pain. Only the sea, murmurous behind the dingy checkerboard of houses, told of the unrest, the precariousness of all things in this world. And gazing in the direction of the bay, Dr. Rieux called to mind the plague fires of which Lucretius tells, which the Athenians kindled on the seashore. The dead were brought there after nightfall, but there wasn't room enough, and the living fought one another with torches for a space where to lay those who had been dear to them, for they had rather engage in bloody conflicts than abandon their dead to the waves. A picture rose before him of the red glow of the pyres mirrored on a wine-dark, slumberous sea, battling torches whirling sparks across the darkness, and thick, fetid smoke rising toward the watchful sky. Yes, it wasn't beyond the bounds of possibility. But these extravagant forebodings dwindled in the light of reason. True, the word plague had been uttered. True, at this very moment 1 or 2 victims were being seized and laid low by the disease. Still, that could stop, or be stopped. It was only a matter of lucidly recognizing what had to be recognized, of dispelling extraneous shadows and doing what needed to be done. Then the plague would come to an end, because it was unthinkable, or rather because one thought of it on misleading lines. If, as was most likely, it died out, all would be well. If not, one would know it anyhow for what it was, and what steps should be taken for coping with and finally overcoming it. The doctor opened the window, and at once the noises of the town grew louder. The brief intermittent sibilance of a machine saw came from a nearby workshop. Rieux pulled himself together. There lay certitude. There, in the daily round. All the rest hung on mere threads and trivial contingencies. You couldn't waste your time on it. The thing was to do your job as it should be done.